Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, get ready because today we are embarking on a truly mind-bending journey into the very foundation of how our society defines sanity. We're going to fundamentally challenge how you view the world around you, and we're going to do it by unpacking one of the most provocative philosophical works of the 20th century. Okay, let's dive right into this. What we're looking at here is Michel Foucault's absolute landmark work, History of Madness in the Classical Age. Now, you might be wondering what kind of book this is. Well, Foucault isn't presenting a medical textbook here. Instead, it's this massive, sweeping historical analysis that covers over 400 years of European history. And he reveals something pretty astonishing. Madness is not just an objective medical fact that science somehow slowly figured out over time. Actually, scratch that, it's far more than that. It's a constantly shifting cultural construct. Foucault argues that how a society treats its quote-unquote mad tells us way more about that society's fears and its deep need for control than it does about any actual illness.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the duality of reason and madness. Second, the ship of fools and the Renaissance. Third, the great confinement. Fourth, madness as a sin. Fifth, the birth of the mental patient. And finally, the madness of geniuses.
Section 1. The duality of reason and madness, setting the philosophical stage. So the crucial point here is really understanding the era Foucault focuses his critique on, which is the classical age. Think of the Enlightenment, right? That's a time we usually praise for logic, science, and the birth of modern reason. But Foucault argues it was precisely here, during this incredibly strict, uncompromising era spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, that the delicate relationship between reason and unreason was violently severed. This is the exact moment when madness was truly alienated and silenced from society for the very first time. Section 2. The Ship of Fools in the Renaissance, a mystical integration. To really wrap your head around this shift, just keep this timeline in your mental map. As the Middle Ages ended, leprosy actually largely vanished from Europe. And that massive shift left behind these empty physical structures, but also a profound, empty psychological space for exclusion. So, moving into the 16th century during the Renaissance, madness basically stepped directly into that void, but the culture treated it as integrated and somewhat mystical. That radically shifts in 1661 when the classical age triggers what's known as the Great Confinement, which ultimately leads us to the late 18th century and the rise of the modern medical clinic. Let's look a little closer at that first era, the Renaissance. Foucault traces the Renaissance attitude through a totally fascinating historical and literary phenomenon called the Ship of Fools. And yes, these were literal, actual boats. Madmen were expelled from the boundaries of European cities, put onto these boats, and just left to drift along rivers like the Rhine. They lived in this profound state of liminality, like an endless in-between purgatory. It's wild to think about, but a madman on these waters was essentially a prisoner of the freest, most open of routes. He was totally disconnected from the land he came from and completely ignorant of whatever destination was ahead. He belonged entirely to the crossing itself, just existing in this mystical, deeply uncertain world.
And this sets up a really vital contrast. Back in the Renaissance, madness was fluid, much like the water those ships of fools sailed upon. It was intertwined with reason. In fact, poets and artists were often seen to possess a touch of madness, right? It was a respected, albeit mysterious part of the human experience. But as we crash into the classical age, that fluidity literally freezes into stone. Madness becomes entirely separated, rigidly defined, and physically hidden away behind thick walls.
Section 3. The Great Confinement, Suppressing Unreason.
Let's move to 1661 and see how this builds, because this year is a massive turning point. In 1661, the General Hospital was established in France by royal decree. But listen, do not let that word hospital fool you. This was absolutely not a medical institution. It was an invention of the classical age meant purely for imprisonment, correction, and social control. It was basically a brutal tool of oppression, designed to sweep the streets clear of literally anything that offended the new, strict rationalism of the Enlightenment.
Now, what's really interesting about this is who was actually locked up together in these massive fortresses. I mean, yes, the madmen were there, but alongside them, you had poor vagrants, the unemployed, social deviants, controversial writers, and get this, spendthrifts and magicians. No way, right? If you were bad with your money or practiced a little magic, you could literally be locked away in a fortress. And this proves Foucault's absolute core argument. The General Hospital had absolutely nothing to do with curing illness. It was just a gigantic net
cast by society to suppress anyone and everyone who represented a threat to reason and social order.
Section 4. Madness as a sin and crime. The moral judgment.
So, with all this mass confinement happening, the societal lens fundamentally changed. The classical age basically took that mystical tolerance of the Renaissance and replaced it with a really deep, arrogant moral judgment. Madness was no longer this reflection of the otherworldly, it was explicitly deemed a crime against reason. It became entirely synonymous with guilt, a sin against the body, and a willful error of the mind. If you didn't fit into their incredibly strict schema of rational productivity, you were morally condemned and locked away. That linkage between unreason and guilt was forged right here, and unfortunately it would persist for centuries.
Section 5. The Revolution and Birth of the Mental Patient. Modernity arrives.
Okay, so following the French Revolution and all those new declarations of human rights, the overt, in-your-face brutality of the Great Confinement just couldn't stand anymore. The physical chains were supposedly struck off. But take a look at this evolution of exclusion. Society simply repurposed its structures of control. We went from the leprosariums of the Middle Ages to the general hospital prisons of the Classical Age, and finally to the modern psychological clinic. And while the 19th century clinic birthed the mental patient and claimed to offer actual medical treatment, Foucault argues it was really just a new, sanitized form of societal control. The physical chains of the Classical Age, they were simply replaced by the invisible chains of psychiatric authority.
Section 6. The Madness of Geniuses. Judging Reason. The Ultimate Reversal. And this brilliantly illustrates the final philosophical twist Foucault leaves us with. He ultimately looks to the profound boundary-breaking works of art and literature. He points to incredible figures like Nietzsche, the painter Goya, the poet Hölderlin. He argues their genius actually emerged from a state of madness that completely shattered the confines of rational control. Foucault essentially concludes that there is no reason in the world capable of rising to the level of Nietzsche's unique madness. Ultimately, it's this boundless, creative madness that stands in judgment of our arrogant, restrictive Western reason, not the other way around.
Which leaves us pondering this final, deeply provocative question. Does reason truly judge madness? Or, as Foucault suggests, is everything we define as sanity today merely a temporary, fragile reflection of our own society's current need for order, productivity, and control? I really want you to think about how we draw the lines of normality in our modern lives today, and who gets pushed to the outside because of it. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.